To put it in a very sort of general way, there was a time where everybody who was born on this planet arrived on an Earth that was already evolved and set up through natural forces. So the Earth previously was always found, was how it was independent of us. What the synthetic age suggests is that from here on forwards, the Earth will be made, not found, but made. We will be reshaping it from the ground up. And this creates an enormous additional kind of responsibility in our decision making.
Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Silos with me, Sophia Jamil. As mentioned in the introduction, this episode is done in collaboration with the East-West Center as part of their Spring Virtual Institute for their academic fellows under the Young Southeast Asian Young Leaders Initiative, or YSEALI. This episode is the third of 8 episodes where we will be exploring different issues and themes related to environmental sustainability. And what's exciting about these episodes is many of the questions that are posed to our guest speakers are from the fellows themselves. And these fellows are young Southeast Asians doing, great work in terms of environmental conservation and sustainability. So I'm very happy to have Professor Christopher Preston from the University of Montana today. Christopher Preston is a professor of philosophy at the University of Montana. His areas of specialty include environmental philosophy, the ethics of emerging technologies, rewilding, and feminist philosophy. He's a native of England and has studied and worked in Alaska, Norway, Washington, D.C., the Netherlands, and South Carolina. And his life is oriented around the power of wild landscapes and the power that humans have to change them. In addition to being a professor, he has worked as a commercial fisherman, a tool librarian, and a backcountry park service ranger. Christopher has published extensively on climate engineering, synthetic biology, and the new epoch of the Anthropocene. His award-winning book, The Synthetic Age, has been translated into 5 languages, and we'll be talking a bit about the book. Thank you, Christopher, for joining me. Maybe you could tell us a bit briefly about the main arguments you make in The Synthetic Age and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on, Sophia. So I work in environmental philosophy, which broadly speaking is about the relationship humans have to the natural world. And people started talking about the Anthropocene maybe 10 years ago in this area. They started saying, wow, humans have had impact across every surface of the planet. In the atmosphere, on the ocean, on land. There's no way you can go where you can't see human impact. And this changes the relationship to the world. The world is no longer untouched, no longer pristine. But serious as that is, I thought there was something else going on because I've been working in some of these technologies. And what some of these emerging technologies do is they don't just impact the surface of the Earth. They get under the surface and rearrange how the world works. So there's various sorts of biotechnology that rearrange how inheritance works. There's climate engineering that rearranges how energy comes in through the atmosphere. And so these all seemed like a deeper impact on the Earth, which gives humans a deeper kind of responsibility for their actions. So I thought it was time to say, look, this is not just the Anthropocene, where humans have left a mess in every corner of the globe. This is the synthetic age, where humans are starting to really reshape the Earth from the atom and molecule all the way up to the atmosphere.
Right. And what do you think are the implications of doing that?
Well, the implications, I think, are huge. To put it in a very sort of general way, there was a time where everybody who was born on this planet arrived on an Earth that was already evolved and set up through natural forces. So the Earth previously was always found, was how it was independent of us. What the synthetic age suggests is that from here on forwards, the Earth will be made, not found, but made. We will be reshaping it from the ground up. And this creates an enormous additional kind of responsibility in our decision making.
Right, right. I mean, how is it that we've come to this point where we are so bold, or rather, some of these scientists are so bold to say we can totally reshape the world, we can make things which were, supposedly natural. I mean, how did this sort of mentality, this shift become? I mean, it seems to me that it's like the Industrial Revolution on steroids, by like a gazillion times or so. I mean, yeah.
That's exactly right. It is the Industrial Revolution on steroids. But let's be clear, it's not unnatural to want to change your surroundings a little bit. I mean, every animal on Earth tries to create for itself an environment, a niche in which it can be comfortable and which it can reproduce. So it's not unnatural for humans to want to shape the Earth. But what's come within our reach recently are technologies that don't just reshape the surface, but reshape the fundamental processes. And I think this is taking an additional step. It's more than just saying, well, look, I want to make a comfortable environment in which to live. It's saying, let's take the way this Earth used to work and let's improve it for our needs and our interests. And so it's not completely unnatural to want to do this, but the level at which we can now do it is beyond anything that has come before.
Right. And it also seems that there is a lack of study on the implications of these technologies. I mean, it may sound great, ideally, but I think the long-term implications, or even the short-term implications, of actually doing these sort of technologies isn't the science behind it probably isn't as substantive. Would you say so?
Well, one always wants a technology to be safe. Any technology over the last 10,000 years, people wanted to make sure that it wasn't harmful. But I think what is new and what is different is the types of systems that we now have the power to manipulate. So the genome, for example, or the climate system, that the types of systems are becoming increasingly complex. So our power is increasing, of course, and that's not a bad thing. But this power is being applied to systems which are increasingly complex, and in some cases complex in a way that it's almost impossible to be confident of the consequences. And that's the danger line, I think, where you're messing around with systems that sort of been here for billions of years. And we haven't really meddled with them before, and now we're sticking our fingers into those systems. And yeah, it causes a little bit of concern, I think.
I'm very concerned. I mean, so I briefly mentioned to you that I've been doing work on Islamic environmental ethics, and in Sumatra, in Indonesia, they have a local saying, "Alam terkambang menjadi guru," which is nature is your teacher. So we should be learning from nature, and the natural processes that that nature has, we can learn from them. But this seems that we're not just letting nature be the teacher; we're trying to teach the teacher. So that alarms me, and I think it also. Would you say it's also part of the problem is that there's been this dichotomous relation between what is considered rational and what's irrational, what's scientific, and other beliefs that may be more superstitious. But in a way, some ethics fall under this so-called superstition. Would you say? I mean, it seems to be that split between, or that distinction between rationality and science has just gone a bit overboard, and there's less space for that ethical thinking in a way.
Well, I got sort of lucky my way into these topics. I worked with the US National Science Foundation ago, started to realize that the technologies coming their way were so complicated and promised such a manipulation of the earth that they needed ethicists on the grant. So if you had a grant that was, funding 10 scientists to do some kind of biotechnology experiment, the National Science Foundation insisted that you put an ethicist on the grant. And half the time what the ethicist did was just creating trouble. I was there to say, this is potentially dangerous, or this crosses this ethical line. But I tell you that because I don't think it's the case that science completely ignores ethics. A sort of rationalistic science would completely ignore ethics. But I think that science is by nature reductivist. By nature reductivist and mechanical. You sort of pull something apart and see how the individual pieces work. And pulling things apart like that, I mean, it provides a lot of knowledge, no doubt. But when you're pulling apart a system which is very complex, as I was saying earlier, the level of complexity of the system, then that reductive thinking sometimes doesn't tell the whole story. And so, for example, when you manipulate genomes, CRISPR-Cas9 will go in and will edit one particular gene or even particular base pairs. And you think you might be able to do that reductively. You sort of take one thing out and put one thing back and everything else stays the same. But it turns out it's not always that way. Sometimes when you fiddle around with one little part of the genome, something else happens over there that you weren't even thinking about altering. And so I think this reductive approach is obviously useful, but bumps up against certain limits.
Right. So you were saying that when you were part of that team of ethicists that were making trouble, that's. I mean, I just like to ask a bit more about that point. So the ethicists, were they looking from ethics? What kind of literature were you looking at in terms of ethics? I mean, were there also some of them that looked at ethics from, say, other societies, other civilizations?
That's always the worry, isn't it? To make sure that whatever critical lens you're bringing to bear on something, that lens needs to be broad enough and diverse enough to spot the problems. And so, I, just because of my training and my upbringing, I come mostly from a Western ethical tradition, and the big names in the ethical tradition that I come out of are people like Immanuel Kant and Aristotle and John Stuart Mill. So I come out of that tradition, and so my lens has certain parameters to it. Of course, the best thing you can do is to make your ethical analysis as broad and diverse and as inclusive as it possibly can be. And some of these technologies raise the importance of doing that to a much higher degree, because they're technologies which will actually be deployed not in the cultural context that many of the creators of these technologies come from, but in cultural context half a world away to solve a particular problem. Like, for example, gene drives to eradicate mosquitoes that cause malaria. These are technologies being developed in, let's say there's one group at Harvard working on this, there's a group at the University of California in San Diego, but the first application of the technology is likely to be in Central Africa. And so the cultural context in which the technology is going to get deployed is massively different from the cultural context in which the technology is going to get developed. So if you are going to do an adequate job of looking at the ethics, you need to make sure that your ethicists, and for that matter, your scientists and your social scientists and your policy experts, you need to make sure that they are representative of the place and the situation in which the actual stakeholders live and live and work and make their lives.
Right, right. I mean, I just might add a bit more relating to mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue. And similarly, in Singapore, the government has used this sort of technology to cut down the spread of dengue through mosquitoes. But in terms of application, we can't just depend on the technology itself. It had to come with a lot of other environmental policies and initiatives, such as ensuring that the waterways are clean. Every so often, you have an environmental inspector coming to door to door to check, hey, do you have stagnant water in your flower pots or something? And if they find one, you get $100 fine for something like that. So it's all these other policies that need to be in place rather than just depending on the technology. And I think that's where you have a more encompassing and more effective rollout of whatever initiatives that are planned. So I think that's just to add on how the knowing the local context is important, and knowing the other issues that are playing is really important. So just to say that the worry when it comes to the applicability of these big technologies in, say, Southeast Asia, that has always worried me, because there's a lot of, even before we talk about these big technologies being, put it into being applied in Southeast Asia, just normal development issues fail to take into account local practices, local knowledge. So it seems the more the tech comes, the less local knowledge is being valued. But at the same time, that's the essence of how environments and ecologies in this part of the world works. So yeah, that's my main worry.
Yeah, and I think you can add to that there's some cultures in which the idea of a technological fix, so the idea of solving a problem straight out of the lab, is much more a priority, much more of a mindset than other countries. And I think the coronavirus is an interesting example. If you think of the United States and its response to the coronavirus, a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of focus was put into vaccines, because the vaccine was the technological fix that was promising salvation. Less effort and energy was put into the public health context, and the sort of local, broader-based solutions about keeping communities safe and keeping communities protected from each other. And so, that mindset of the technological fix, I think it's important to be very aware of how, when you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail, right? You have to be very sort of aware of how you can start to look at solutions through a technological mindset rather than what might be a more effective or equally effective social or political or public health kind of mindset.
Right. So that begs the question that if there are these solutions from this, social, political, or cultural spheres, what's pushing the tech? I mean, is it just money and interest by certain companies or lobbyists? If you had any thoughts on that.
It's really tricky. I think it really varies, but it's the right question to ask for sure. What is pushing this as a solution rather than this as a solution? It's going to vary from technology to technology. Some technologies are recognized as so powerful that even the scientists developing them understand that they should only be developed as a public good. So climate engineering is a good example of this. Climate engineering, in theory, allows the possibility of putting particles in the stratosphere to cool down the planet by interfering with incoming solar radiation. And that is a global strategy. You can't climate engineer just for one state or one country. If you climate engineer, you basically climate engineer for the whole world. The people who are working on these technologies have agreed that this should not be a technology which is profit-driven. There's just too much at stake socially, ethically, to have this technology driven by the interests of business. And so they've said it would only be deployed as a public good with some kind of public funding and decision-making made at whatever level could be worked out to be appropriate. That itself would be an enormous challenge. But there's an agreement by the scientists that such a technology is only appropriate as a public good. There's other technologies that may not have that constraint on them, that may be profit-driven. And those are certainly the ones that you need to sort of be looking at and asking, well, what sorts of global changes might these cause? And what are the interests of those who are advancing the technologies?
Right. Would you say artificial meats are one of those?
I think most people in the artificial meat industry are in it because it's a business opportunity. I think as an ethicist, I also see it as a potentially an ethical opportunity because obviously it reduces the need to cause animals to suffer. But I think the business opportunity might be a more significant driver of artificial meats. So then, as the ethicist, one says, okay, I need to sort of, my ears need to perk up when I think it's being driven by business. But then I need to look at it and say, okay, but is this a technology which is going to cause a significant enough change in how we interact with the planet, how we interact with each other, how traditional ways of living and working might get eliminated and replaced. So you look at that and you say, are these changes that we should worry about or not? And maybe they won't be. Maybe they'll be appropriate changes, or maybe they will be changes that cause the crash of certain important pastimes and certain traditional ways of living on the land, and we might want to think about it before doing that.
Right. I mean, just the thought about going to a plant-based diet. I mean, even if we've, before, factory farm meat, a lot of the traditional societies were already plant-based. And in fact, they already had various, traditional recipes where they were all plant-based. Take, for example, in Indonesia or in Malaysia, there are so many varieties, but a lot of these plants, you don't find them in the supermarket. It's not your conventional plants that people are accustomed to eating. It's not capsicum, it's not tomatoes. It's a very specific plant that you tend to find more wild, grown in the wild, so to say. But yeah, these were all very medicinal, very healthy. It's just that I would say there hasn't been that push to market these sort of plant-based foods, which are more healthy and more natural rather than something that's been processed. So, and yeah, so I mean, those are some issues I see with regards to the artificial meat industry. I mean, it's great to have burgers that are plant-based, but I think there's so much more, especially in the developing world, which have always had vegetarian diets. It's why do we need it? I mean, people might call me old-fashioned, but yeah, that's just my take on it.
It's a challenging one, because I mean, here in the United States, people eat more meat, I think, than in any other country in the world, or at least in the top 2 or 3 countries. And so, one has to look around oneself and say, well, people are going to eat meat, and given the enormous burden that the production of beef puts on the planet, if you could take a chunk of that burden away by producing a synthetic meat or a clean meat elsewhere, it might be worth doing. You need to answer the questions first of whether synthetic meat does in fact reduce the burden on the planet. I mean, it's a fairly energy intensive process. It might be the case that what looks initially like a very environmentally friendly practice turns out to be not quite as environmentally friendly as thought. I haven't looked at it in detail, so I don't really know the numbers there. But it's an interesting case in point, because even though, as you say, one's natural reaction might be to say, why would we need to go to a lab to produce meat? The benefits could end up outweighing the costs. If it said, it might be the case that the benefits don't outweigh the costs, and we should know that before proceeding.
Right, right. I mean, some of our fellows had raised some concerns about that, like you've mentioned, whether the benefits really outweigh the costs. And another concern they have is, what does this do to the livelihoods of traditional meat producers? And if that happens, what are the alternatives for these farmers? I mean, already you see it in India, and in other parts of the world where there have been protests by farmers because they're not being treated fairly. And here, this is potentially another, attack on on them. So it really depends on seeing who it benefits. And
yeah. And when you think about the raising of livestock in a traditional fashion, that those traditions are available to anybody. Anybody who has some space and has the sort of family tradition. The production of synthetic meat, that's not available to anybody. That's going to be the producing of it. That's going to be done in a particular highly technologized setting by people with financial backing and with the power and influence to set up such a business. So as an ethicist, I would be looking at this and I would be saying, well, one practice, the traditional way of raising livestock, is a democratizing practice. The other practice is one that concentrates power, concentrates wealth, and creates dependence. It creates people dependent on those who have the technology to produce clean meat. So, it's definitely, ethically, it's a very, very complicated issue, I think, clean meat, synthetic meat.
Right. I mean, it's sort of history repeating itself. I mean, who has the power, who has the money, who has the power, ends up controlling, half the population, so to say. Maybe we'll take a few questions from our fellows. Trisha from the Philippines says, I'm interested to know more about how we can weave the old style of preservation with that of the age of new technology. Sothia Roth from Cambodia also says, with the technology, we can see how it re-engineers our mindset and continues to do so in our daily lives. To save the planet, do we need to invent more technology or just go back to living with less technology for preservation?
That's the biggest question of all, right? What is the right path ahead? So in terms of the first question about conservation, environmental protection, should it be technology focused or not? The old style conservation, quote unquote, old style, at least, well, the one, so I'll talk out of my cultural context from living in the United States. That style of conservation was one of saying, let's set aside parks and preserves. Let's make sure people live elsewhere, not in those parks and preserves, and let's allow nature to flourish on its own terms, by itself, and we don't take part. Two major problems there. One major problem is that model, which is sometimes called the parks and preserves model, completely ignored the presence of indigenous people on the landscape. And enormous cultural crimes were committed in the process of evicting people off of landscapes on which they'd lived for thousands of years. So there's one giant problem, which is a problem that comes out of a certain sort of history. But then there's a second giant problem, which is a more contemporary problem, which is the problem of the Anthropocene. So when we started talking, we talked about the Anthropocene as being this epoch where the human influence is everywhere. And the human influence being everywhere is now in those parks and preserves, whether those parks and preserves are up in Alaska or whether they're closer to me here. I don't live too far from Yellowstone National Park. But that human influence, the increased invasive species, the pressures around the edge of the park by people who make their living there, these human influences are not going away. They're real, and they cause real harm and real damage to some of the native species. So it seems like there's two reasons why that model, that parks and preserves model, where you sort of put a fence around something and leave and hope nature's going to be okay. There's two reasons to look really, to scrutinize that with a new sense of questioning about whether that's the right way to do conservation. Now, what's the better way to do conservation? Well, the first thing is to look at that first problem and think about the value that indigenous people have always brought to landscape management. The unique skill set, the unique knowledge. There's plenty of evidence that the biodiversity hotspots around the world are not the places where fences have been put up and people kicked out, but are the places where people continue to live traditional lifestyles. So that's one way to chart a better path forward, is to recognize the possibility for a positive relationship between people and landscape, instead of thinking landscape's only healthy when people are off it. And then the second question is the slightly more difficult one. What if restoring some of those environmental values does involve the application of a new technology, a new and a powerful technology? Should one deploy technologies in natural areas which will ultimately change the naturalness of that area? You know, once you've sort of put the human imprint on that area, it's there. And you can put a human imprint on an area by polluting the area, but you can also put a human imprint on the area by manipulating it with your technology. And that's a question that I've asked in some of my work. A gene drive, for example. So a gene drive is a technique in biotechnology where essentially you can send a trait that you think it will be desirable for some wildlife species to have. You can send a trait out into the wild through the breeding patterns that wild species normally employs. You manipulate a few individuals and then you let them out there to breed, and that trait goes out through into the wild world. A gene drive changes nature, and it probably changes it permanently. So even if your motivation might be to save nature, you're actually changing the thing you're trying to save. And these are very, very sticky, difficult questions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this just made me reflect a bit on Islamic environmental ethics, where this, every living thing has its purpose. So if we were really to change these certain species genetically, what is their purpose? I mean, their purpose changes, and they're probably not going to really live their purpose. So that's something that I was thinking about when you just mentioned that. Your point about the indigenous people and the value that they have in terms of environmental conservation. One of our fellows also mentioned this in her in her hometown from June. June from Indonesia says, "My warmest regards to you, Professor Preston. I'm really excited to read your articles about nature. It makes me more inspired to understand nature itself. Your philosophy reminds me of one of the areas in my hometown called Tanah. Tanah is located in Bulukumba in the South Sulawesi province of Indonesia. They are an indigenous community that believe that humans should preserve nature as a gift from God. If they destroy nature, then they are fighting against God. And it's because of this belief that they have been able to conserve forests and water till today. Um, she says that the problem with that is that the younger generation themselves don't realize these traditional this local knowledge. So from your perspective, how can we try to share this sort of good knowledge and influence the young generations about nature?
So the word gift is a word that my ears perked up when I heard that in the question that was asked there. The word gift comes with a whole lot of sentiments, a whole lot of meanings. If you think of what nature provides as a gift, then the most appropriate reaction you should have to that is gratitude. Gratitude is the appropriate response to any sort of gift. Now, gifts might require a particular traditional worldview. There might be origin stories or creation stories that detail exactly how that gift was given, when it was given, by whom and to whom. And so that word gift has its own cultural context, but similar ideas to the idea of gift can exist in other cultural contexts. And so, let me give an example. Out of the cultural contexts in which I do my work, the notion of value, and especially intrinsic value, is a more common sort of language for talking about the importance of the earth. But I would submit that the idea of intrinsic value does much the same work that the idea of gift does. We arrive on the earth and find ourselves surrounded by gifts, or we arrive on the earth and find ourselves surrounded by values. I think if you can do a little bit of translation, different words, different concepts that come out of different cultures can do similar work. And so you don't necessarily need to rely on one particular tradition. Of course, there's always value in tradition, and if the tradition can remain motivating and remain active, that seems like a very desirable thing to do. But even as traditions change, I think one can sometimes find substitute concepts, substitute ideas that do similar sorts of work. And I think if you spoke to environmentalists around the world, coming out of all sorts of contexts, whether they're indigenous contexts, Western scientific contexts, if you put to them, does the idea of a gift or does the idea of value in the surrounding world, does that convey something important for your environmentalism? I think you would find quite a bit of consensus, perhaps. This sort of positive idea of how the surrounding world gives something to us. I think that's a very widespread and motivating notion in environmentalism.
Right. Okay, we have another question by Ruli Azwa in Indonesia. He's also very impressed by and inspired by your articles. Your work is related to what I'd like to ask you about Sekolah Alam Lusa, translated as Lusa Nature School, and this is a junior high school located near Lusa National Park in Sumatra. This school is about 10 kilometers from my permanent residence in North Sumatra. The education system there meaning the materials and practices and methodologies used are all related to nature. This is in addition to the more general lessons that are taught. But the problem is the existence of this school is not seen as a priority by majority of society living around there. How can we better influence a larger portion of the society to send their children to this nature school? And what can we measure? How can we better measure our achievement in improving nature?
So I'm going to answer that question by making a bit of a sales pitch for ethics. If you recognize that a lot of what we ethical, a lot of the decisions we make are ethical. Am I going to move away to find a certain job somewhere? Yes or no? That's going to depend on what my values are. You know, what does family mean to me? What does my future work and career mean to me? Those are ethical questions. Am I going to develop a particular, let's say, a apartment building here, or am I going to leave this place aside to nature? Those are ethical kinds of decisions. So for me, and this is my sales pitch, ethics is everywhere. And I think I would add a little addition to that sales pitch. Religion is everywhere too. And so when you bump up against the problem that was mentioned in that question, that, well, a lot of people don't seem interested in this particular type of education. A lot of people maybe don't feel like they have time to think about the human relationship to the natural world. My reply is, yes, they do, because a lot of the decisions that people make in their lives are ethical decisions, whether they realize it or not. So if you're lucky enough to do ethics for a living, which is what I do, then you can do worse than keep reminding people how their day-to-day decisions are ethical decisions, and they are decisions that affect the relationship between themselves and the environment. They reflect the relationship between themselves and family, their relationship between themselves and the surrounding community. If that ethicist can keep putting that little word in your ear to say, look, everything you do in life has an ethical and often also a religious dimension to it. Almost everything you do has that dimension. Then I think, at least I hope, this is what I've been spending the last 3 decades of my life doing. I hope you can slowly push people into a mindset where they do start to care more about how their actions reflect a certain ethical approach to nature.
Right. I think that's a great point. And it also, by always keeping ethics in mind, that's where people decide whether perhaps certain technologies are right or not right for their given context. I think that's something that perhaps societies tend to forget, that in this hustle and bustle of keeping with the Joneses and getting good salaries and good jobs and so forth, they tend to forget that it's these basic things and ethical things that really matter at the heart of whatever we do. I definitely agree with that. We have a question from John from the Philippines. Newly established fields in science, such as planetary health and geohealth, were based on the concern of the human health risk from the environment due to pervasive human alteration of the Earth's natural system. The COVID-19 pandemic is notably one of the best examples of why this field should exist. Do you think this field could significantly shift people's perspectives towards improving nature?
So I think, I don't know a lot about the field itself, but from what I do know about it, it's what I would call an Anthropocene field, because it's a field that looks at the Earth as a whole and maps relations between human societies and the human activities that those societies engage in, and the health of the natural world. And it tries to sort of provide an overview of how these different factors relate. The Anthropocene is very much an overview type of age. The Anthropocene is an age where knowledge is amassed from satellites. The Anthropocene is a data age. The Anthropocene is the age where no part of the Earth remains unmapped or unwired or unexplored. So I recognize those fields as Anthropocene types of fields. Now, once you recognize those fields for what they are, I think you face a fork in the road. And the fork in the road is, do we take an Anthropocene field and manipulation of the surrounding world? We have more knowledge, we have more technology, we have the ability to reach further into the more remote parts of the world. So do you use a new field to increase human manipulation? Or do you use a new field in order to take a step back and to pause? And I think that the case of zoonotic diseases transferred from wildlife to humans, are an interesting case in point. I mean, the more we map activities that impact the Earth, the more we know that diseases are animals with diseases have more contact with humans in places they didn't used to have contact with humans. And so the more we can recognize that as a problem, and certainly some of the discussion around COVID-19 has talked about that problem. But the question is, well, all right, what do you do about it? When you think about the cause of disease as being perhaps rooted in these interactions between humans and nature, what do you do about it? Do you then try to pull back, try to leave nature intact? Do you try to say, well, we've stepped over a line here and we should never have stepped over that line? Or do you say, it's too late, we've crossed that line, we just need to be smarter about how we cross that line? And I think that's a real sort of fork in the road that the Anthropocene and the work that I engage in is sort of standing at that fork and saying, we want to go that way into the synthetic age, the ever more synthetic age? Or do we want to go the other way, where we sort of step back a little bit and allow and encourage nature to flourish? And there's a movement, the place I grew up in England, southern England, there's a movement towards rewilding, which is incredibly exciting and unusual and surprising to me, that this fairly densely populated part of the UK is beginning to let some of its agricultural landscapes revert back to natural landscapes, bringing some species back, letting them go, and then stepping back and seeing what happens. And this movement towards rewilding is a way of saying, all right, here's the fork in the road. Do we go more technology, or do we go more nature, more wildlife? And it's evidence that even in a country like the UK, you can choose to go more nature and more wildlife.
Could you tell us a bit more about that? How do they do that?
It's really interesting. It's something that excites me a great deal here. I mean, they're taking landscapes that may have been farmed for centuries. Mm-hmm. And they're saying that the return on this land, based on these practices we've been doing for centuries, it's just not worth it. The financial return, the environmental return, it just doesn't. It's not a desirable set of outcomes. So the first thing you do, and this is literally true in some parts of Europe, the first thing you do is you sell your farm equipment. Literally, you just, I'm not gonna plow this land. I'm not gonna cut these hedges. I'm not gonna put pesticides on this field to get rid of noxious weeds. So you sell your equipment. And then you watch what happens, and you go to historical records and you see what used to be on the landscape. And sometimes what you might do is you might bring a species that used to be on the landscape, you might bring it back. So there's a farm not far from where my parents live in southern England, where deer have been brought back onto the landscape. A type of wild pig has been brought back onto the landscape. And there's an application in under consideration now to bring beavers back on the landscape. So sometimes you bring an animal back and you set it loose and you step away and you let that animal do what it evolved to do. So sometimes it involves a little bit of human manipulation, and other times it doesn't involve any manipulation at all. You just kind of wait and see what happens. And on this particular landscape that I'm talking about, they step back, and which in England have been decreasing for decades, and turtle doves which migrate from southern Europe towards England in the summer, turtle doves just showed up. They just saw this landscape and thought, this is a interesting, wild looking landscape. And they just showed up there. The black stork, which doesn't usually stop over in England. It flies past the English coast. They've had a black stork just show up on the landscape. And so wildlife finds its own way back. And this is known as rewilding, though some of the people like to call it wilding, because if they call it rewilding, it sounds like you want to go back in time to something. And what they like to say is, we're not particularly interested in going back in time. We're interested in looking forwards towards what this landscape can become. So it's really exciting. It's a whole different direction.
How long have they been doing this now?
Well, there's various different sites. This one in the UK near where I grew up has been going for close to 20 years now. There's a bunch of others in the Netherlands, and there's an organization called Rewilding Europe, which has chosen 8 different sites around Europe. What's going on in around these sites that they've chosen is quite a lot of depopulation. Humans are moving out of those landscapes. The birth rates have sunk so low that the countries have stable population or slightly falling population. And agriculture has become efficient in certain places in such a way that it makes it no longer worthwhile to try and grow things in these other places. So they're depopulating, and this space is becoming available. And Rewilding Europe is trying to manage these spaces for their wild values, and also to recognize there's an economic benefit to doing that, because rather than have a failing agricultural economy that no longer really serves the people in on that landscape, you can maybe replace it with some sort of visitor economy or some kind of ecological economy, which obviously has a sort of longer term, more sustainable kind of outlook.
Interesting. I mean, I guess that's really, in a way, nature being the teacher and just, finding their own way to fix the problem by themselves. And I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because it really points to, well, what are the needs for a certain society, for example, in the UK, where you're having a decrease in population, but yet there was still an ability to find that sort of economic or financial motivation that by still protecting the environment or conserving the environment, so to say. It makes me think about permaculture activities in parts of, for example, in a few permaculture activities I've seen in India and in Indonesia, where it's not so much an issue of a population decrease, but rather there is a population that is not having enough access to, say, food. I mean, they might be doing those monocrop, agricultural, activities, but they're not having food for themselves. And what permaculture has done is that it was providing a more diverse range of food for them in that given space, but also at the same time, also bringing back some wildlife species that suddenly turned up and were happy to be in a more biodiverse space. So it's interesting here where we're talking about there are solutions, and it really depends on your specific locale. What are the needs? And this is beyond what just the environment needs, but what does society in a given context needs? So I think these are really important points for our fellows to remember as well, to take note of, that while tech can solve a lot of issues, what is the applicability of the tech in your given landscape or given society? That's
Yeah,
a
and
very good point. Thank you. Yeah.
local knowledge just seems essential here, doesn't it? If you think of tech usually coming from the outside, local knowledge from the inside, if you're looking for these sort of solutions which allow, a long-term economic future, allow for cohabitation, allow for increasing biodiversity, then, the place to live on that landscape for a long, long time.
Absolutely. I think we might sum it up. And this is a couple of questions that I normally ask all my guests on Breaking Silos. What does breaking silos mean to you? And what advice would you give someone who wants to break silos in terms of addressing environmental challenges?
Good question. So, I work at a university. That's where I spend at least half of my time. And often when you think of silos at a university, you think of departments and disciplines. Are you in the humanities and philosophy, or are you in the natural sciences and chemistry? And so there is one way to think about breaking silos as being what you do on a university when you try to work with other people in other departments. But actually, that's not what I want to say I think of when I think of breaking silos. There's another silo, or a set of silos, which is the academic world that has its own sort of methods and its own rewards and its own measures of what's important. And then there's the world that has nothing to do with academics and is more involved with living, making a living, earning enough money to be comfortable in life. And to me, the silo that is the most important one to break down is to break down the silo between those that live and work in a very sort of rarefied, technical, academic type of environment, and those that live on a particular landscape or work in a particular pastime, in a particular tradition. And I think, that there's both parties there, the academic party and the party working on the landscape have a wealth of knowledge to bring, but they usually don't know how to talk to each other. If I pull an article out of a philosophy journal and hand it to somebody outside of that academic environment, it would not help them one bit. It would be completely unhelpful. And so breaking down whatever it is that keeps producers of knowledge apart from each other. So, producers of knowledge can be indigenous persons, they can be agriculturalists, they can be academics, they can be engineers, they can be technical specialists. Allowing producers of knowledge to interact helpfully with each other is so essential and so hard to do. And certainly as my career at the university has gone on, initially I thought, well, what I need to be doing is publishing articles in academic journals and, doing what academics are supposed to be doing. But more and more, it's clear to me that what I need to be doing is having conversations outside of the academy with people who know more than me about many, many different topics. And so, the follow-up part of your question is, what's the best way to break down those silos, or what advice do you have? I think in terms of the need for courage, I think in terms of the need for nimbleness. So courage to say, I'm going to step out of my comfort zone and I'm going to reach out and engage with somebody else who knows more than me about something. And I'm going to feel pretty foolish when I first do that. But I'll be learning right from day one. I'll be learning. So courage, nimbleness, because you come from your particular context with a certain set of assumptions about what matters. And as soon as you get out of your context into somebody else's context, those assumptions very rapidly get destroyed. What I thought matters isn't actually what matters out here in this situation. And so I think people who are going to break down silos need a kind of nimbleness to say, well, this is how I came here with these thoughts, but now I need to change what I'm thinking. I need to be flexible enough, nimble enough to see that what matters here is different from what I thought. So courage, nimbleness, and then the third thing that I wanted to say is important is empathy and compassion. The ability to sort of get out of and to imagine a problem from a different perspective, or imagine a worldview that somebody else holds that might be completely alien to you, but will be full of insights if you can just empathize enough to sort of reach across the conceptual divide or the cultural divide. If you can just stretch out with enough empathy and compassion to really start to understand the situation of people outside of your environment, I think that shows great promise and creates great hope to do things better.
Right. I totally agree with that last point about showing empathy, and it's about listening to people, and it's not just about what you think anymore or what your great ideas are, but rather listening to people and hearing people. I mean, having that openness actually is really difficult for some people who have been stuck in a certain academic silo. I mean, I'm speaking for myself and how my own experience of stepping out of academia and going into business, it's totally different world, and how you communicate, it's totally different. And in a way you have to dumb down all that academic jargon, but really just keep it. Be nimble and keep it short and sweet, which I think a lot of academics find hard to do sometimes. So and a lot of the business people I meet, they will say, okay, yeah, that's an interesting problem, way of looking at a problem. So what's your solution? So we are good at thinking about how the world works, but the business folk are always saying, so what's your solution to it? So it's really having to come out of that academic thinking. I think that takes a lot of effort as well. But I mean, I think the more that people are willing to slowly step out and try it progressively, I think we all will be in a better. We'll have a better world and better outcome in many things that we do. Yeah, thank you, Christopher, for your time. Is there any last final words you wanted to say to our fellows or any and our listeners out there?
Well, I was thinking as you were speaking that you yourself are a wonderful example of having courage and the nimbleness and the empathy and compassion, because you've done it. You sort of
I'm trying.
You've created something, and I just have huge admiration for people who do that. It's very easy to find a comfortable spot and stay there. But the challenges the environmental challenges that we're presented with, and the high stakes that the technologies that are arriving, the high stakes that those bring, mean that we shouldn't just sit where we're comfortable and sort of enjoy the ride. We should sort of jump in and try and make sure that we're making good decisions about how to shape the future.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Christopher. And folks, thank you for joining us in this episode. I hope you've learned a lot. And stay tuned for our next episode. And once again, thank you to Christopher and to everybody there, to everybody out there. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Thank you.